Welcome to Middle East Briefing. The content of the briefing includes: out of the coup, how a palace putsch helped make Qatar a global peace broker. Islamic countries ask US play broader role to press Israel on Gaza ceasefire. Dreadful night, Israeli tanks hit center of Khan Yunis, UN seeks ceasefire. Syria's al-Assad in supporting Hamas, for political gain or optics. French frigate shoots down drones over Red Sea, military. Out of the coup, how a palace putsch helped make Qatar a global peace broker. South China Morning Post. Qatar's success as a mediator in the Israel-Gaza war has put the tiny Gulf nation back in the spotlight. Despite its small native population, Qatar has managed to broker peace deals between the United States and the Taliban, as well as mediating an end to the Palestinian civil war and preventing a crisis in Lebanon from escalating. Qatar's success in diplomacy can be traced back to a bloodless palace coup in 1995, when the new emir, Sheikh Hamad, overthrew his father. The new emir was motivated by his father's refusal to exploit Qatar's natural gas reserves and invest in the production of exportable liquefied natural gas. As a result, Qatar's all-in bet on LNG paid off, transforming the country's economy and giving it the means to resist strategic domination by its neighbors. Qatar has also pursued an independent foreign policy, which has allowed it to become a major player in conflict resolution in the wider Islamic world. The country has invested heavily in projecting soft power, including through positive media coverage and the establishment of the Al Jazeera news channel. Qatar has also signed agreements with the U.S., allowing the Pentagon to establish a forward headquarters for the U.S. military's Central Command. This has enabled the country to endure an air, land, and sea embargo by its neighbors from 2017 to 2021. Qatar's LNG wealth has empowered it on the international stage, allowing it to exercise considerable autonomy and pursue a multipolar foreign policy. Islamic countries ask US play broader role to press Israel on Gaza ceasefire. South China Morning Post. Arab and Islamic countries have called on the US to pressure Israel into accepting a ceasefire in the Gaza war. The call was made during a meeting in Washington between Qatari, Egyptian, Jordanian, Saudi, Palestinian, and Turkish foreign ministers with U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken. The officials expressed their disappointment at the UN Security Council's failure to pass a resolution for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza, after the U.S. used its veto power. Israeli attacks on Gaza have claimed another 133 lives in the last 24 hours, according to the Hamas-run health ministry. Dreadful night, Israeli tanks hit center of Khan Yunis, UN seeks ceasefire. South China Morning Post. Israeli tanks have reached the center of Khan Yunis, the main city in the southern Gaza Strip. After a truce collapsed, Israel launched the storm of Khan Yunis this week, extending its ground war to Gaza's southern half. The airstrikes and tank shelling has left the enclave's 2.3 million people with nowhere to hide. Syria's al-Assad in supporting Hamas, for political gain or optics. Al Jazeera. Syria has played a muted role in its support of Hamas amid the regional fallout from Israel's war on Gaza. After a decade-long break from the Syrian civil war, Hamas re-established ties with the regime of President Bashar al-Assad. The reconciliation was encouraged by Hezbollah and Iran to counter the growing number of Arab governments normalizing relations with Israel through the Abraham Accords. Syria contributes little to Hamas's material strength, but its position within the alliance with Iran and Hezbollah remains a significant factor in escalating violence across the region. French frigate shoots down drones over Red Sea, military. Al Jazeera. A French frigate has intercepted and shot down 2 drones in the Red Sea that were believed to be approaching from the coast of Yemen. The frigate Languedoc intercepted the drones, which were approaching from the Yemeni coast, late on Saturday. The Houthis, who are backed by Iran, have threatened to attack any vessels heading to Israeli ports unless food and medicine are allowed into the besieged Gaza Strip. The group warned all ships and companies against dealing with Israeli ports and said that ships linked to Israel are not welcome in the Red Sea. Egypt presidential election, El-Sisi vies for third term. Deutsche Welle. Egyptians have begun voting in a presidential election in which President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi is expected to win a second term. El-Sisi, who initially came to power in 2013 following a coup d'état, faces no serious challengers in the election. He is likely to rule until 2030 after term limits were adjusted by a constitutional amendment last year. The election is being overshadowed by the ongoing Israel-Hamas conflict in Gaza, with a focus on Egypt's northeastern borders and the suffering of Palestinians. El-Sisi is up against 3 other candidates, but giant billboards with his pictures dwarf those of his competitors. Who's a colonizer? How an old word became a new weapon. New York Times. The debate surrounding colonialism and its legacy has resurfaced in recent years, as people grapple with issues of domination, prejudice, and oppression. The term colonial has become a popular insult used to criticize neo-colonialism and Western dominance. This battle over colonialism has even affected the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, with pro-Palestinian protesters accusing Israel of being a settler colonial state. However, some argue that transposing the colonial narrative onto the Israeli-Palestinian conflict oversimplifies and distorts the complexities of the situation. The conflict in Israel-Palestine is deeply entangled with colonial history. The establishment of Israel was seen as an attempt to impose a colonial reality on Palestine in a post-colonial age. However, others argue that the conflict cannot be reduced to a colonial framework, as both Israelis and Palestinians are historically indigenous peoples with deep connections to the land. While the Israeli settlement of the West Bank does have colonial characteristics, applying the colonizer label to Israel as a whole fails to capture its diverse, multi-hued society. The re-emergence of colonialism as a withering accusation can be attributed to a reframing of world affairs from an East-West conflict to a North-South battle. The Global South views Israel as an extension of colonialism into the 20th and 21st centuries, while the West sees it as a beacon of freedom rising from the ashes of the Holocaust. The wounds of colonialism have not fully healed, and the struggle for dignity continues. The debate over colonialism and its legacy is part of a larger movement towards justice and equality. Advancements in medical care could be saving lives amid conflicts around the world. Yahoo! Doctors, nurses, and other medical professionals are often performing under extreme duress with a limited number of tools compared to working in a traditional hospital setting. There have been medical advances over the centuries when it comes to battlefield medicine, both in the training and the equipment used, but more recent improvements in care may be helping save more lives in wars, such as the one in Ukraine and ongoing Israel-Hamas conflict, than were available a decade or two ago. Experts told ABC News that some of the innovations are in the technology used, such as portable laboratories, to organizational changes, such as making sure civilians are also receiving basic health care on top of surgical care to prevent a separate public health crisis from emerging. A fraught question for the moment: is anti-Zionism always anti-Semitic? New York Times. The brutal shedding of Jewish blood on October 7, followed by Israel's relentless military assault on Gaza, has brought a fraught question to the fore in a moment of surging bigotry and domestic political gamesmanship. Is anti-Zionism by definition anti-Semitism? The question deeply divided congressional Democrats this week when Republican leaders, seeking to drive a wedge between American Jews and the political party that 3/4 of them call their own, put it to a vote in the House. It has shaken the country's campuses and reverberated in its city streets, where pro-Palestinian protesters bellow chants calling for Palestine to be free from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. It surfaced in Wednesday's Republican presidential debate, when Nikki Haley, the former South Carolina governor, said, "If you don't think Israel has a right to exist, that is anti-Semitic." The following night, lighting the national menorah behind the White House, Vice President Kamala Harris's husband, Doug Emhoff, who is Jewish, warned, "When Jews are targeted because of their beliefs or identity, and when Israel is singled out because of anti-Jewish hatred, that is anti-Semitism." Zionism as a concept was once clearly understood: the belief that Jews, who have endured persecution for millenniums, needed refuge and self-determination in the land of their ancestors. The word still evokes joyful pride among many Jews in the State of Israel, which was established 75 years ago and repeatedly defended itself against attacks from Arab neighbors that aimed to annihilate it. If anti-Zionism a century ago meant opposing the international effort to set up a Jewish state in what was then a British-controlled territory called Palestine, it now suggests the elimination of Israel as the sovereign homeland of the Jews. That, many Jews in Israel and the diaspora say, is indistinguishable from hatred of Jews generally, or anti-Semitism. Yet some critics of Israel say they equate Zionism with a continuing project of expanding the Jewish state. That effort animates an Israeli government bent on settling ever more parts of the West Bank that some Israelis, as well as the United States and other Western powers, had proposed as a separate state for the Palestinian people. Expanding those settlements, to Israel's critics, conjures images of settler colonialists and apartheid-style oppressors. So for some Jews, the answer to the question is obvious. Of course, anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, they say. Around half the world's Jews live in Israel, and destroying it, or ending its status as a refuge where they are assured of governing themselves, would imperil a people who have faced annihilation time and again. There is no debate, said Jonathan Greenblatt, the chief executive of the Anti-Defamation League, which has been defining and monitoring anti-Semitism since 1913. Anti-Zionism is predicated on one concept, the denial of rights to one people. Many Palestinians and their allies recoil just as fiercely, the equating of opposition to a Jewish state on once Arab land or opposition to its expansion with bigotry is to silence their national aspirations, muffle political dissent and denigrate 75 years of their suffering. Layla El-Haddad, a Palestinian activist and author, called it a chilling attempt to punish and silence voices critical of Israeli policies. But perhaps nowhere is the question more fraught than among Jews themselves. Younger, left-leaning Jews, steeped in the cause of anti-racism and terms like settler colonialism, are increasingly searching for a Jewish identity centered more on religious values like the pursuit of justice and repairing the world than on collective nationalism tied to the land of Israel. Many older liberal Jews have also struggled with the Israeli government's lurch to the far right, but they see Israel as the centerpiece and guarantor of continued Jewish existence in an ever more secular world. We're living in an increasingly post-religious age, and any Jewish community that walks away from the Jewish people, and its most articulate expression of our times, the Jewish state, the State of Israel, is walking away from their own future, said Amiel Hirsch, the senior rabbi of Stephen Wise Free Synagogue in Manhattan and the founder of Amplify Israel, which seeks to emphasize the Jewish state in Jewish worship. For Republicans, the issue is simple and convenient. The raising of anti-Zionism in the debate over anti-Semitism amid the Israel-Hamas war pushes aside the presence of white nationalist bigots on the fringes of the Republican coalition, like Nick Fuentes, the avowed neo-Nazi who dined with Kanye West and former President Donald J. Trump last year, and instead forces Democrats to defend the pro-Hamas demonstrators on their own coalition's fringes. So on Tuesday, when GOP leaders led by Representative David Kustoff of Tennessee, one of the House's two Jewish Republicans, put to a vote a resolution condemning all forms of anti-Semitism and flatly stated that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, the 216 Republicans who voted yes included two who have been accused of anti-Semitism and white nationalist flirtations, Representatives Paul Gosar of Arizona and Marjorie Taylor Greene of Georgia. The one Republican who voted no, Representative Thomas Massie of Kentucky, has now been labeled anti-Semitic by the White House. For the broader Democratic community, by contrast, the debate has been wrenching, pitting allies against one another, splintering more conservative Jewish Democrats who absolutely believe anti-Zionism is anti-Semitic from progressive Democrats, especially Democrats of color, who argue just as strongly for the latitude to criticize Israel, and leaving a huge middle unwilling to draw bright lines. 13 Democrats voted no, including Israel's fiercest critics in Congress, Ilhan Omar of Minnesota, Rashida Tlaib of Michigan and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez of New York. 95 voted yes, but 92 Democrats voted present, among them prominent Jews like Gerald Nadler of New York, Jamie Raskin of Maryland and Jan Schakowsky of Illinois. Folks, this isn't complicated. Most anti-Zionism, the type that calls for Israel's destruction, denying its right to exist, is anti-Semitic. This type is used to cloak hatred of Jews, Mr. Nadler wrote on social media after the vote. Some anti-Zionism isn't that. Thus, it's simply inaccurate to call all anti-Zionism anti-Semitic. In fact, it is complicated. Jonathan Jacoby, the director of the Nexus Task Force, a group of academics and Jewish activists affiliated with the Bard Center for the Study of Hate, said the group had wrestled with the issue for several years now, seeking a definition of anti-Semitism that captures when anti-Zionism crosses from political belief to bigotry. He warned that shouting down any political action directed against Israel as anti-Semitic made it harder for Jews to call out actual anti-Semitism, while stifling honest conversation about Israel's government and U.S. policy toward it. The definition of anti-Semitism as drafted by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance and embraced by the Trump White House includes phrases that critics say squelch political, not hate, speech, denying the Jewish people their right to self-determination, such as by claiming that the existence of a state of Israel is a racist endeavor, applying double standards by requiring of Israel behavior not expected or demanded of any other democratic nation, comparing contemporary Israeli policy to that of the Nazis. The Nexus definition agrees that holding Jews around the world responsible for Israeli government actions, as pro-Palestinian protesters did last week outside an Israeli restaurant in Philadelphia, is Jew hatred. It also holds that it is anti-Semitic to reject the right of Jews alone to define themselves as a people and exercise self-determination, as some on the left do in arguing that Jews are a religion, not a nation. But Nexus pushes back sharply on some aspects of the IHRA definition, stating, paying disproportionate attention to Israel and treating Israel differently than other countries is not prima facie proof of anti-Semitism, and opposition to Zionism and/or Israel does not necessarily reflect specific anti-Jewish animus. Yehuda Kurtzer, the president of the Shalom Hartman Institute, a Jewish research organization, said that Judaism had always contained elements of religion and nationhood, and that Jewish identity had toggled between the two over the millenniums. It is unsurprising that the two strains can seem baffling, he said. Since the rise of violent white supremacy that accompanied the political movement of Mr. Trump, Jewish intellectuals have viewed right-wing antisemitism as dangerous to Jewish bodies, Mr. Kurtzer continued. The 2018 Pittsburgh synagogue massacre that took 11 Jewish lives was perpetrated by an adherent to the Great Replacement theory, a conspiratorial fiction designed to create race hatred by holding that Jews are importing black and brown people to supplant white Americans. Amid such carnage, left-wing antisemitism, driven by opponents of the Jewish state, was seen as more academic, a threat to Jewish identity, but not to Jewish safety, he said. But Mr. Kurtzer said those distinctions disappeared with the massacre of some 1,200 Jewish Israelis in October, because Hamas's actions were the end result of denying Israel's right to exist. October 7 should have the effect of saying absolute hatred of Judaism for our national claims is violent and legitimizes violence, he said. In other words, virulent anti-Zionism and virulent anti-Semitism ultimately intersect, at a very bad address for the Jews. Still, Democrats worry that the debate is blurring the line between political speech and hate speech. Tibetans pressing for freedom from the Chinese are considered unserious or even repugnant in Beijing, just as Native American activists demanding to reclaim parts of the United States might be to the owners of that land. But are they bigoted? Ms. Omar said the Republican resolution that she opposed conflates criticism of the Israeli government with antisemitism and paints critics of the Israeli government as antisemites. To the young Jewish activists of left-wing groups like If Not Now and Jewish Voice for Peace, which have themselves been accused of antisemitism, the search for a Jewish identity unrooted in the land has not been complicated. Jews, after all, survived without a state for nearly 2,000 years after the Romans destroyed the Second Temple in Jerusalem and scattered the inhabitants of the Holy Land to the four corners of the earth. Eva Borgwart, the 27-year-old political director of If Not Now, said she graduated high school wanting to be a rabbi. Now she speaks of a renaissance of Jewish identity in the United States, a diasporic chicken farm, queer Talmudic studies and a Judaism. Iran and Saudi Arabia to negotiate on direct scheduled flights. ILNA. Reuters. Iran and Saudi Arabia are set to begin formal talks to resume direct flights between the two countries, according to an Iranian official. The move is part of a wider effort to restore ties between the two regional rivals, following the restoration of diplomatic relations in March. The two countries severed ties in 2016, following the execution of a Shiite cleric by Saudi Arabia. The resumption of flights would include travel for both religious and non-religious purposes. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Dr. Six reporting from the 6 Degrees World, bringing you the latest news updates from around the globe. Today, we discussed Qatar's success as a global peace broker, the call for a ceasefire in the Israel-Gaza conflict, the situation in Khan Yunis, Syria's support of Hamas, a French frigate shooting down drones over the Red Sea, Egypt's presidential election, the debate over anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, advancements in medical care in conflict zones, and the resumption of talks between Iran and Saudi Arabia on direct flights. Now, let's dive into a deeper analysis of these news stories. Qatar's success in diplomacy can be attributed to its bloodless palace coup in 1995, which allowed the country to focus on exploiting its natural gas reserves and invest in the production of exportable liquefied natural gas. This transformed Qatar's economy and gave it the means to resist strategic domination by its neighbors. Qatar's pursuit of an independent foreign policy and investment in projecting soft power have also contributed to its success as a mediator in conflicts in the wider Islamic world. In the Israel-Gaza conflict, Arab and Islamic countries have called on the U.S. to pressure Israel into accepting a ceasefire. The failure of the UN Security Council to pass a resolution for an immediate ceasefire has led to growing frustration among these countries. The situation in Khan Yunis is dire, with Israeli tanks reaching the city and leaving the population with nowhere to hide. The conflict has also had regional implications, with Syria playing a muted role in its support of Hamas to counter the growing number of Arab governments normalizing relations with Israel. Meanwhile, a French frigate has intercepted and shot down drones over the Red Sea that were believed to be approaching from the coast of Yemen. The Houthis, backed by Iran, have threatened to attack vessels heading to Israeli ports unless food and medicine are allowed into Gaza. This highlights the complexity of the regional dynamics and the role of different actors in the conflict. In Egypt, President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi is expected to win a second term in the presidential election. The ongoing Israel-Hamas conflict is overshadowing the election, with a focus on Egypt's northeastern borders and the suffering of Palestinians. El-Sisi's likely victory raises questions about the future of democracy in Egypt, especially after term limits were adjusted by a constitutional amendment last year. The debate over anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism has resurfaced in the context of the Israel-Gaza conflict. The term colonial has become a popular insult used to criticize neo-colonialism and Western dominance, but its application to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict oversimplifies the complexities of the situation. The re-emergence of colonialism as a withering accusation can be attributed to a reframing of world affairs from an East-West conflict to a North-South battle. This debate is part of a larger movement towards justice and equality. Advancements in medical care are playing a crucial role in saving lives amid conflicts around the world. Medical professionals are performing under extreme duress, but recent improvements in care, such as portable laboratories and organizational changes, are helping to prevent a separate public health crisis from emerging. Lastly, Iran and Saudi Arabia are set to begin formal talks to resume direct flights between the two countries. This is part of a wider effort to restore ties between the regional rivals, following the restoration of diplomatic relations earlier this year. The resumption of flights would allow for travel for both religious and non-religious purposes. That's all we have for today's news updates. Remember, it's important to stay informed and engage in these discussions. Now, I'd like to hear from you, our viewers. What are your thoughts on these news stories? Do you have any questions or opinions you'd like to share? Let's keep the conversation going. Thank you for tuning in. The content above showcases the latest briefing reports and analytical synopses, thoughtfully curated by the 6Do team. These insights stem from a wide array of reputable media outlets, think tanks, government sources, and specialized experts worldwide. We encourage you to explore these sources for a comprehensive perspective. Keep in mind that while the content may not always align with the official standpoint of 6Do Brief, it's not meant to be taken as absolute directives for decision-making. Comprising seasoned media professionals, learned scholars, and accomplished scientists, the 6Do team embodies a trailblazing, fully independent media entity. To customize 6Do Brief to meet your professional needs, you have the option to subscribe to a diverse array of briefings on our website, 6dobrief.com. Regardless of your location, you can conveniently receive 6Do Brief via email.